The little girl's voice was barely a whisper beneath the city's morning rush, yet it sliced through the hum of car engines and hurried footsteps like a siren. "If I eat just a little, maybe there'll be some left for Grandma." Those words stopped Alexander Grant in his tracks. New York's youngest billionaire, the man whose empire stretched across continents suddenly frozen by a voice smaller than a heartbeat. "Before you scroll away, tell me, what would you have done if you heard that?" Because what Alexander did next would not only shock everyone who knew him, it would shatter everything he thought he was. Stay with this story. What happens next might just restore your faith in humanity. The rain had just begun to fall, thin and cold, the kind that blurred reflections in the glass towers of Midtown. Alexander walked fast, his umbrella held by the bodyguard 3 steps behind his schedule, packed to the minute breakfast meeting at the Met investor call at 10 acquisition review before noon. His world was numbers, precision, efficiency. Feelings were liabilities. That was how he'd survived, how he'd built Grant Technologies before he turned 30. But that voice, that fragile, trembling voice, cracked the rhythm of his life. He turned, scanning the sidewalk until he saw her, a small figure, no taller than the pastry counter she was staring at through the fogged bakery window. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Her shoes soaked a torn paper bag clutched to her chest. Inside was a half loaf of bread, its crust dark and uneven, the kind sold cheap at the end of the day. She wasn't crying, just whispering softly to herself, a ritual of hope for a grandmother waiting somewhere hungry. For a moment, Alexander's instinct was to keep walking. People suffered every day. It wasn't his fault, not his job. That's what he told himself whenever charity requests flooded his inbox. But something inside him, something that had been silent for years, tightened. He looked at his reflection in the bakery window, saw not the polished billionaire but a man who had once known hunger of a different kind, the hunger for care, for someone who stayed. He took a hesitant step toward the girl. His bodyguard frowned, whispering, "Sir, the car's ready." But Alexander waved him off. "Give me a minute." Those words alone were shocking. Alexander Grant didn't do a minute. He did schedules, contracts, signatures, but never pauses. When he reached her, the girl flinched slightly but didn't move away. Her name, he would later learn, was Emma. In that moment, she was just a child staring at a world of bread she couldn't afford. Her lips trembled as she looked up at him. "I'm not stealing," she said quickly, as if that might keep trouble away. "I know," Alexander replied softly, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, hesitating. "But Grandma's more hungry. She hasn't eaten since yesterday." Her honesty hit him harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Without another word, Alexander opened the bakery door, the chime announcing his presence in a place far below his usual haunts. The warmth and smell of baked bread washed over him. The cashier stared. His suit alone cost more than the month's rent for this shop. He pointed at the display. "We'll take everything fresh. Box it up." The girl's eyes widened. "All of it." He smiled faintly. "All of it." For once, the act of spending money didn't feel like indulgence. It felt like redemption. As the cashier packed the goods, Emma stood on tiptoe, her fingers twitching with disbelief. Outside, the rain turned heavier, tapping against the window like the rhythm of fate. Alexander crouched beside her, holding out a small sweet roll. "This one's for you," he said. She hesitated, then took it, her hands shaking. She bit into it slowly, as if each bite were a memory she wanted to last. That's when Alexander noticed something, a faint scar near her wrist, the kind left by a rough life. "Where's your grandma now?" he asked. "Home," she said between bites. "She's sick. I was going to bring her some bread." A horn blared outside the waiting car. His assistant's voice buzzed through his earpiece, reminding him the investors were waiting in Tokyo for his live conference. Missing this call could cost millions, but for the first time in years, Alexander didn't care about the numbers. "Come on," he said, standing. "Let's take the food to your grandma." The girl blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "In your car?" He nodded. "You'll show me the way?" She smiled, small, hesitant but real. That smile, he would later realize, was the beginning of everything. As they stepped into the rain, people turned to stare. Alexander Grant, the untouchable billionaire, walking through puddles beside a barefoot child. Somewhere behind him, his assistant's voice shouted through the phone, "Mr. Grant, are you out of your mind?" Maybe he was, but for the first time in his life, losing control didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. He didn't know it yet, but that single decision, the choice to follow a hungry child instead of a business schedule, would unravel every wall he had built around his heart. It would lead him to places he'd long forgotten, faces from his past, and one truth that money had never been able to buy: the power of being human again. And as the car door closed and Emma whispered directions to a neighborhood he'd never seen, Alexander glanced at the bread in her lap, then at the city rushing by outside the tinted windows. He felt something shift inside him, something profound. He didn't have words for it yet, but he knew this life, for the first time, was about to get real. The car rolled through the narrow streets of Brooklyn, where the glittering skyline of Manhattan faded into a patchwork of worn brick buildings and cracked sidewalks. The rain had eased to a mist clinging to the windows like breath. Alexander Grant sat in silence, watching the little girl in the seat beside him clutch a bag of bread as if it were gold. Every few blocks she'd glance at him with cautious curiosity, her small hand resting protectively over the paper sack. "Almost there," Emma murmured, her voice soft but certain. She pointed to a faded mural of sunflowers on the wall ahead. "Turn right there. We live close to the one with the flowers." Her directions were simple, almost poetic: turn where the road smells like coffee, go past the fence with blue hearts. The driver glanced in the mirror, unsure, but Alexander nodded. Follow her lead. When the car finally stopped, Emma jumped out, holding the bag close to her chest. The building before them was old and weary, its bricks stained by decades of storms. A cracked sign above the door read, "Riverside Apartments," though no river was anywhere in sight. The air smelled faintly of rain and stale bread. Alexander followed her inside. The hallway was dimly lit, narrow, the walls patched and painted unevenly. Each door had its own story told in scratches and stickers. "We're up here," she said, climbing the stairs quickly despite her thin legs. Her small hand brushed against the banister for balance. On the third floor, she stopped before a pale green door with chipped paint. She knocked softly. "Grandma, it's me. I brought food." For a moment, silence. Then came the sound of slow footsteps and a cough, dry and raspy. The door opened just enough for a woman to appear, a woman whose tired face still carried traces of grace. Her hair was streaked with silver, tied back neatly, and her eyes, though weary, were sharp and kind. "Emma," she whispered, her voice strained. "Where have you—" She stopped mid-sentence as her gaze lifted to Alexander, who stood awkwardly behind the child, his suit still damp from the rain. "Grandma." "This is Mr. Alexander," Emma said proudly. "He bought food for us. Lots of it." Grace blinked, confusion and disbelief flickering in her eyes. Then slowly, her expression softened. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself, sir," she said, her voice polite, almost formal. "It was no trouble," Alexander replied. Emma looked hungry. "I just wanted to help." Grace stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The apartment was small but spotless. A faded rug covered the floor, and the faint aroma of tea leaves lingered in the air. The furniture was second-hand but arranged carefully, each item placed with purpose. On the wall hung a few pencil drawings, flowers, birds, a smiling child, clearly Emma's handiwork. "You've made it cozy," Alexander said quietly. Grace smiled faintly. "When you have little, you learn to make the little you have beautiful." Emma was already unpacking the bakery boxes onto the table. Loaves of bread, sweet rolls, a small chocolate cake. Her excitement filled the room. "Grandma, look, he bought soup too. Real soup with vegetables." Grace's eyes glistened. She turned away, pretending to adjust the tablecloth, but Alexander saw her wipe a tear. "You didn't have to do all this," she repeated softly. "I wanted to," he said simply. They sat down as Emma began to eat small bites at first, then faster, her hunger breaking through her manners. Alexander watched her, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. It had been years since he'd shared a meal that felt this human. No catered plates, no business chatter, just the sound of spoons tapping and a little girl sighing with contentment. As Grace sipped her soup, she glanced at Alexander. "You remind me of someone," she said after a pause. "When I was younger, I worked for a family in Manhattan. The Reeds, I think they were called. They had a boy, quiet, polite, but lonely. You look a bit like him." Alexander froze his spoon halfway to his lips. The Reeds, Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, his father was strict, his mother distant. That boy spent more time in the kitchen with me than in his own room. Always asked for elephant-shaped pancakes." She smiled at the memory. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain against the window filled the silence. Then Alexander said quietly, "My mother left when I was 9. My father fired the woman who raised me soon after." He looked at her, his expression soft but haunted. Her name was Grace. The spoon slipped from Grace's hand, clattering against the table. Her breath caught. "Alexander," she whispered, disbelief trembling in her tone. He nodded, a faint, almost childlike smile breaking through his composure. "You made the best pancakes in the world." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she reached across the table, her frail fingers brushing his hand. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said. "You were just a boy, and now look at you." Emma looked between them confused. "You know each other." Grace laughed through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I used to take care of him when he was little. I made him breakfast every morning." Alexander exhaled, the weight of memory pressing on his chest. "You were the only person who noticed when I was sad," he said. "You'd sneak me cookies before bed and tell me everything would be okay." Grace smiled faintly. "I told you that because I wanted it to be true." The air grew still. Alexander looked around the tiny apartment again, taking in the cracks in the ceiling, the peeling paint, the quiet dignity in every corner. He reached for his wallet instinctively. Money was the only tool he knew for fixing things. But Grace stopped him gently. "Don't," she said. "You can't buy what matters, Alexander." He lowered his hand. Her words struck deeper than any lecture or scandal ever had. Emma, oblivious to the heaviness in the room, leaned over and whispered, "Grandma, can I give him one of my drawings?" Grace smiled. "Of course." The little girl darted to the wall, tugged down a sheet of paper, and handed it to him. It was a child's sketch of 3 figures, Emma, her grandmother, and a tall man in a suit, all holding hands, under a sun with a crooked smile. Alexander stared at it for a long time. Something inside him cracked wide open. He folded the drawing carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and said quietly, "Thank you, Emma. I'll keep it." That night, when he finally returned to his penthouse, he didn't turn on the lights. The city sparkled below, cold and distant, but for once Alexander didn't feel powerful. He felt human, achingly, beautifully human. And somewhere deep in his chest, a thought began to take root, small but unstoppable. Maybe there was a way to help them that wasn't charity at all. Something built with purpose, something real. The next morning, Alexander returned to the old apartment building in Brooklyn. The city was still damp from the night's rain, and the streets glistened under a pale gray sky. He didn't quite understand why he came back. Maybe it was unfinished business, or maybe it was something deeper, the pull of something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. Grace opened the door, surprise flickering in her eyes, when she saw him standing there with a paper bag in his hand. "I brought coffee," he said awkwardly, "and some fruit. I wasn't sure what you liked." She smiled, stepping aside to let him in. Anything that isn't canned is a luxury here. Inside the apartment looked just as he remembered, small but spotless. The morning light fell through the thin curtains, touching the edges of worn furniture with a kind of tenderness. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing with colored pencils. She jumped up when she saw him. "Mr. Alexander, you came back. I promised I would," he said, setting the coffee on the table. She beamed, holding up her latest drawing, an elephant-shaped pancake. "Grandma says you used to love these." "I still do," he admitted, smiling. "I guess I never outgrew them." Grace chuckled softly, her cough briefly interrupting the sound. She waved him toward the table. "Sit. I just finished warming up the soup from yesterday. It's not much, but you're welcome to join us." Alexander hesitated. He wasn't used to being invited into a place like this, not since he was a boy sitting in the warmth of Grace's old kitchen. He took a seat, feeling strangely humbled. The soup was simple vegetables, a hint of broth, but it tasted real. It tasted like care. After a few moments, Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "You've changed, Alexander. You used to sit on the counter swinging your legs waiting for pancakes. You never liked the quiet." "I still don't," he said. "The difference is, now I pay people to fill the silence." She gave him a knowing look. "And does it help?" He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted to the window, where the cracked glass reflected a city he'd built his life around, one that suddenly looked different through this frame. He took in the surroundings again, the patched wallpaper, the potted plant on the sill, the drawings taped beside the fridge. This was poverty, yes, but it wasn't hopelessness. It was resilience. Grace and Emma had so little, yet somehow their home carried more warmth than his entire penthouse. Grace must have noticed his expression. "We don't have much," she said quietly, "but we have each other. That's enough most days." He nodded. "I forgot what that felt like." She studied him for a long moment before asking, "Why did you really come back?" The question caught him off guard. He wanted to say it was to help to repay an old kindness, to make up for something, but none of that felt entirely true. "Because when I left yesterday, he finally said I couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it is that someone like you has to live like this while I sit in an apartment big enough for 20 people. Grace smiled faintly. "Life isn't fair, Alexander. But it doesn't mean it's empty. I could fix this," he said impulsively. "I could help you get you a better place, pay for medicine school for Emma. Anything you need." Grace's face softened, but her tone remained steady. "You already helped. You showed up." He frowned, not understanding. "That's not enough. It is," she said firmly. "Money solves problems, but not the right ones. You think we need saving. What we need is dignity." Her words struck him like a blow. Dignity. It was a word he'd heard often in business, tossed around in press statements and charity banquets, but never understood until now. Grace wasn't refusing help out of pride. She was defending her sense of worth. The silence stretched between them. Emma, unaware of the tension, leaned against him, her small head resting on his arm. "Mr. Alexander, do you have a grandma?" she asked suddenly. He hesitated. "No," he said softly. "Not anymore." "Then you can borrow mine," she said matter-of-factly. Grace chuckled, but there was a hint of emotion in her eyes. "I'd like that," Alexander said, his voice low. Grace reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she poured him more coffee. "You know," she said, "the boy I remember used to bring me drawings just like hers. You said you wanted to be an architect." "I said that because you told me houses could feel alive," he replied. "I guess I stopped believing that when you left." "I didn't leave Alexander," she said gently. "I was told to go." He looked up, guilt flashing across his face. My father, Grace, shook her head. He was a man trapped by his own pride. "I didn't blame him then, and I don't now." He exhaled a mixture of shame and relief washing over him. He fired the only person who ever made that house feel like home. "And now," she said with a small smile, "life has a strange way of circling back." As the afternoon light began to fade, Alexander found himself staying longer than he intended. He helped Emma wash dishes awkwardly, trying to dry them without breaking anything. She laughed every time he fumbled, and even Grace couldn't help but smile at the sight of the billionaire clumsily handling chipped plates. When it was time to leave, he stood at the door, unsure how to say goodbye. Grace handed him a paper bag filled with bread. "Take this," she said, "for later." He looked down at it, then back at her. "You're giving me food when you barely have enough, because kindness only works when it goes both ways," she said simply. He carried the bag with him all the way to his car. Inside, he opened it and found tucked between the slices of bread a folded note in Grace's handwriting. "You can't fix the world, Alexander, but you can start by feeding one soul at a time, even if that soul is your own." That night, he stood in his penthouse kitchen, the city light sprawling beneath him. The bread sat untouched on the counter, but the note stayed in his hand. For the first time in years, Alexander realized how empty success could feel when no one was there to share it. The next morning, before the sun rose, he was already drafting plans. Not business proposals, not mergers, not deals, but something entirely different. Something that would bring warmth back into a world too cold for compassion. It started with a smell, fresh bread rising in a cold oven, the scent of something new beginning. The idea had come to Alexander late one night, as he stood alone in his penthouse kitchen, Grace's note lying open on the counter. "You can't fix the world, but you can start by feeding one soul at a time." That line stayed with him until dawn. By sunrise, he'd already made the call. A month later, an old cafe on the corner of Castle Street stood bathed in scaffolding and dust. It had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its sign faded to nothing. Now it was alive again, workmen scraping, painting, measuring. Alexander was there every morning, suit sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand, the smell of plaster and hope hanging in the air. Grace didn't believe him at first when he told her what he wanted to do. "A bakery, Alexander, that's extravagant," she'd said, shaking her head. "You don't need to do this for us." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm doing it with you." She'd smiled faintly, but didn't argue. Over the weeks that followed, she began to see he was serious. He involved her in every detail, the name, the recipes, the colors on the wall. He wanted the place to feel like home, not a corporate project. When she suggested calling it Grace and Emma's Bakery, he hesitated. "Your name should be on it too," she said. He shook his head. "It already is." Emma became the heartbeat of the place. She drew the first sketches for the logo, 2 loaves shaped like open hands. She'd sit on a flour sack near the counter, watching the builders with wide eyes, peppering them with questions about ovens and mixers. When the first delivery truck arrived with sacks of flour, she clapped her hands like it was Christmas morning. For Alexander, the process was both foreign and grounding. His empire was built on algorithms and automation, but here, every detail was tactile, imperfect human. He learned how to knead dough from Grace. His first attempts were clumsy, his hands stiff from years of holding phones instead of tools. She'd laugh at him gently, correcting his technique. "You're too careful," she said. Bread doesn't want control. It wants patience. He found himself staying later each day, covered in flower sleeves rolled to his elbows, talking with the staff and local vendors. He met the florist down the street who promised to fill the windows with sunflowers on opening day. He struck a deal with a small dairy farm for fresh butter, and slowly the bakery began to take shape not just as a shop, but as a promise. The first day they tested the ovens, the smell of baking bread filled the empty room. Grace stood quietly at the counter, tears in her eyes. "It smells like my mother's kitchen," she said softly. "It smells like home," Alexander added. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People peeked in through the windows, curious about the fancy man helping paint shelves and scrub floors. One evening, a group of kids from the nearby school stopped by, offering to help clean in exchange for cookies when the bakery opened. Grace, of course, agreed. "No one leaves hungry," she told them. As the weeks passed, the place transformed from a renovation site into something living and warm. Soft lights, wooden counters, hand-painted signs, a chalkboard menu Emma insisted on writing herself. Every piece carried a story. The walls, once bare, were now filled with framed drawings from neighborhood children, a thank you from the community before the first loaf was even sold. The night before the opening, Grace confessed her fears. "What if no one comes?" she asked, sitting beside the ovens while the dough rested under clean cloths. "What if we fail?" Alexander looked at her. His face calm, the flowers streaked across his cheek. "Then we'll start again," he said. "Failure's just a batch that didn't rise." The next morning, when they opened the doors, the line stretched down the block. Locals' office workers, parents with kids all drawn by the aroma of fresh bread and the buzz of something hopeful. Grace stood behind the counter, her hands trembling as she handed out the first loaf. On the house, she said to the first customer, a construction worker who looked stunned. Within hours, every loaf was gone. By noon, the shelves were empty, and the air was filled with laughter chatter and the hum of something greater than business. Emma ran around serving cookies, her face dusted with sugar. When a little boy asked what made the bread taste so good, she said proudly, "Because it's made with love and second chances." Alexander stood near the window watching the crowd spill out onto the sidewalk. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Grace caught his eye and smiled, her face glowing with pride. "You did it," she said. "No," he answered, shaking his head. "We did." That evening, after closing, they sat together at one of the wooden tables. The lights were dim, the shelves empty, the smell of bread lingering in the air. Grace sipped her tea and looked around. "You know," she said, "this isn't just a bakery. It's a place where people remember they're not alone." Alexander nodded, his voice low. "That's all I ever wanted to build." Outside, the city glowed the same as always. But inside that little bakery on Castle Street, something had changed. It wasn't just about bread anymore. It was about forgiveness, about connection, about rebuilding what life had once broken. And for Alexander, it was the first time in a long time that success had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with heart. A year passed, and Castle Street had changed. The old corner that once smelled of dust and rain now carried the warm scent of fresh bread every morning. Grace and Emma's bakery had become more than a local shop. It was a story people wanted to be part of. There were always lines out the door, but no one seemed to mind waiting. Inside, laughter blended with the clatter of trays and the hum of life being lived fully. Alexander moved easily among the customers, no longer the polished billionaire in tailored suits, but A man with rolled sleeves and a heart that finally found its place. He came in early every day, sometimes before sunrise. He would stand by the window, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up. It still amazed him that something so simple, a loaf of bread, a shared table, could change so many lives. The bakery had become a meeting point for the forgotten corners of New York: teachers, single parents, old men from the park, construction workers, even executives from downtown who slipped in for quiet coffee before their day began. Grace called it a sanctuary that smells like hope. Emma had grown taller, her confidence blooming with the bakery. She was the face of every local article, her picture smiling under headlines like "The Girl Who Inspired a Billionaire's Change of Heart." But fame never touched her innocence. Every day she greeted customers by name, handed out cookies to children, and made sure no one ever left empty-handed. Alexander had promised Grace that all proceeds from the first year would go into community programs: free meals for the elderly, baking lessons for kids, job opportunities for single mothers. He'd never seen money create such joy before. One Sunday morning, as sunlight spilled across the tables, Grace sat near the counter humming softly while folding napkins. Her hands trembled more these days, but her eyes were peaceful. "You've done something rare, Alexander," she said as he handed her tea. "You turned profit into purpose." He smiled, looking around at the full tables. "You taught me how." That afternoon, the bakery hosted a small event, Emma's school presentation. Her teacher had asked her to share a story about kindness. The room filled quickly, customers turning their chairs toward the front as Emma climbed onto a stool, clutching her paper. She cleared her throat, her voice shaking just a little. "My story is about how a stranger stopped to listen one rainy day, and because he did, I got my grandma back, and we all got something better than money. We got family." The crowd grew quiet, the kind of silence that feels sacred. "Kindness," she continued, "is like bread. You give some away, and somehow you always end up with more." Grace's eyes glistened. Alexander felt something shift in his chest again. The same ache that started this all now transformed into something lighter, steadier. He glanced out the window where the sky had begun to turn gold. For a fleeting moment he thought of his father, cold, unreachable, and wished he could see this. Maybe then he'd understand that legacy wasn't built on wealth, but on how you made people feel. When the applause ended, a woman lingered at the doorway. Her clothes were worn, her eyes cautious but filled with something fragile, hope mixed with fear. She looked at Grace, then at Emma. Grace froze her breath, catching. "Carmen," she whispered. The room fell silent. Emma's eyes widened as the woman stepped closer, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," Carmen said. "I made mistakes. I lost my way. But I never stopped thinking about her." Grace stood slowly, her frail hands gripping the edge of the table. "You're home now," she said, her voice trembling but sure. Emma ran into her mother's arms without hesitation, the kind of forgiveness only a child can give. The crowd turned away politely, some wiping their own eyes. Alexander stayed still, watching the reunion unfold like a quiet miracle. Later that night, after the bakery closed, they sat together, Grace, Carmen, Emma, and Alexander, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread. No words could capture what that moment meant. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was full of love, forgiveness, and peace. As the evening deepened, Grace leaned back in her chair, a faint smile on her lips. "This," she said, gesturing around the table, "is what life is supposed to taste like." Alexander knotted his throat tight. "Like home," he murmured. In the weeks that followed, the bakery flourished even more. Carmen started working there quietly, rebuilding her life. Grace, though weaker, refused to rest, insisting she had too much dough left to knead. Emma continued to draw pictures for the Walls family portraits that now included her mother. And Alexander, though still running his company, spent most of his time on Castle Street. The board members had questioned his priorities, but he no longer cared. For the first time, his life was measured not in stock reports, but in smiles and shared stories. On the anniversary of the bakery's opening, they hosted a free breakfast for the neighborhood. The line stretched around the block. Alexander stood by the door greeting people, and when someone asked why a billionaire would spend his Sundays serving bread, he answered simply, "Because this is what makes me rich." As the morning sun climbed higher, Emma tugged his sleeve. "Alexander," she said, grinning up at him, "you remember what Grandma used to say, 'You can't fix the world.'" He smiled, finishing the sentence with her, "But you can feed one soul at a time." Grace watched from her chair by the window, her eyes bright with quiet pride. Outside, the city moved fast as always, but inside that small bakery, time seemed to slow. Laughter, warmth, and the smell of bread filled the air. And as Alexander looked around at the faces that had once been strangers but were now family, he understood the miracle of it all, that sometimes one small act of kindness doesn't just change a life, it changes everything. From the moment Alexander Grant stopped on that rainy New York street, everything about his life began to change. The man who once measured worth in numbers and meetings discovered that the true currency of life was compassion. Through a simple act of kindness, buying bread for a hungry girl and her grandmother, he opened a door he didn't know existed. It led him away from the noise of wealth and into the quiet, steady rhythm of humanity. Alexander's journey wasn't about redemption through grand gestures. It was about transformation through humility. In Grace, he found the woman who had once cared for him when no one else did. In Emma, he found the childlike innocence he had lost somewhere between ambition and isolation. Together, they reminded him that the smallest moments, sharing food, laughter, forgiveness, carry more weight than any fortune ever could. The bakery on Castle Street became the living symbol of that transformation. It wasn't just a business. It was a heartbeat, a place where kindness baked itself into every loaf, where dignity was restored with each smile. Through it, Alexander built something far greater than an empire. He built a home for people who needed to feel seen, fed, and valued. Grace's wisdom, Emma's warmth, and his newfound purpose turned that small bakery into a sanctuary that touched an entire community. By the time Grace passed, her legacy had already taken root in everyone who crossed that bakery's threshold. Alexander continued her vision not as a billionaire trying to save the world, but as a man who understood that real change begins with one simple decision to care. The miracle wasn't in the bread or the building, or even in the success. It was in the hearts that healed because one man chose to stop and listen. The lesson from this story is timeless. Kindness doesn't need to be big to be powerful. One thoughtful act can change the course of someone's life and your own. In a world obsessed with speed control and success, we often forget the strength that lies in slowing down and noticing others. True success is not about accumulation, it's about contribution. The measure of a meaningful life is not what we own, but what we give. If you take anything from Alexander's story, let it be this: you don't need wealth to make an impact. You only need heart. Start small, offer help where you can, listen without judgment, give without expecting. Because kindness is the one investment that never fails, it multiplies, it heals, and it returns in ways we can't always see. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lost or something you want to find again, don't let it end here. Let it inspire you to act, to share, to bring light where it's needed most. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this story with someone who might need it. Every time you do, you help us continue creating stories that restore hope and remind the world that compassion still matters. After all, like Grace once said, kindness only works when it goes both ways. So, here's your chance, pass it on.
If you want this type of stories, then subscribe to Golden Chapter Whispers.